Well, good evening. Thank you to everybody joining us tonight for this panel organized by the New England chapter of the Society of Professional Journalists on the Pandora Papers, which is an investigation published by the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists and in collaboration with 150 news outlets from around the world. We are joined by two ICIJ journalists who were part of this investigation, Asraa Mustufa and Will Fitzgibbon. Asraa is a digital editor for ICIJ, and Will is a senior reporter of ICIJ, who, well, along with being a lead reporter on the Pandora Papers, was also part of the Panama Papers and the FinCEN files. This means they're both really busy, so we're very thankful that you took some time off your busy schedule to chat with us. So welcome, and welcome.
Thank you. Great to be here.
Yeah, our pleasure.
So I assumed here, everybody here has already read the Pandora Papers, but for those who haven't read it, I think it's a good way to start by explaining what the Pandora Papers are and what are some of the most important findings.
Do you want me to jump into that, Asraa? Okay, sure. So the Pandora Papers really refers to both a set of documents and a huge investigation of journalists. And together, what we did was, over the course of more than a year, collaborated with 600 reporters from around the world on a trove of almost 12 million leaked files that come from so-called offshore service providers. These are kind of basically law firms or accountants whose job is to help the rich and powerful, and sometimes criminal, set up and use secretive offshore companies around the world. Those companies are often in the places you might think of, like the British Virgin Islands or Panama, but they're also in places you might not think of, like the United Arab Emirates, or as we found a lot within the United States, like South Dakota in particular. So ICIJ, everyone at ICIJ is a bit crazy because we do many, many things at once. One is reporting our own stories if we're reporters, like me, but then the other half of our job is identifying stories for reporters in Mongolia or Nigeria or Uruguay, and then helping them through our knowledge of the documents and our experience with the subject matter in bringing those stories to life. And then, of course, Asraa's job is an entirely different beast that would drive anyone to madness, and I'll let her talk about that.
I think one of the big, you were asking what is the big findings or what are the top line outcomes of the investigation. I think the biggest thing is just the number of politicians that we found in the data. There's tycoons, there's criminals, there's famous people, there's all kinds of people in those documents, but we focused on politicians because there's a public interest in understanding the financial activities of our elected officials, because they have the opportunity and power to reform systems of financial secrecy that might be harmful, but we're finding again and again and all around the world that they themselves are taking advantage of these systems. So where's the incentive for them to reform it or to see it as a problem? So that's not only were the names pretty significant, like 35 current and former country leaders, but also is just from a public interest point of view, that seemed like the best story for us to latch onto is like the top line finding. Yeah, so I would say politicians, and then the other big finding of this investigation that I think kind of was clear in this trove compared to maybe Panama Papers is the role of the US. I think the question we got time and time again was, why are there no big US names in this data? Where are the US billionaires? Where are the US politicians? But the US actually plays like another very central role in the offshore economy. You usually think of offshore as like places like British Virgin Islands or Panama or Cayman Islands, but I think Will can talk a little bit more about this, because this is what his reporting was about, was that these documents really revealed the US playing an integral role in like secrecy, financial secrecy around the world.
Yeah, that was one of the, I thought, unique findings of this project, and one of the many reasons I was so happy to do it again, and why it's different from previous investigations like the Panama Papers. Because as time passes, as the years go by, crooks and dodgy people and politicians who might not be crooks and dodgy, but who just want to conceal their financial secrets, there are enough of them out there that they're going to find every crack that they can. So just when one tax haven closes down, another one pops up, excuse me. And places like South Dakota, New Hampshire, Nevada, Delaware, and even Alaska over the past 5 to 15 years, I suppose, have really been aggressively soliciting foreign money in particular. And South Dakota has been incredibly successful at that, soliciting and receiving now more than $370 billion in trust assets under management in Sioux Falls alone, which is huge, given the size of that state, given that state's employee pool. You know, we ended up speaking to a whistleblower who works at a bank in South Dakota who sees a lot of trust documentation come under their eyes, and they were quite concerned and expressed their concern to us that, you know, the training and the regulation on South Dakota trust and shell company employees is really not as strong as it needs to be. You know, how does a 30-year-old who only speaks English really know what the profile of a 70-year-old Brazilian multi-millionaire is? You know, someone like I, thanks to working at ICIJ with the resources of Portuguese speakers, we worked with 20 Brazilian reporters. We can go back 30 years in the past and look at lawsuits and government investigations and Brazilian newspaper reports that say, hang on a minute, this guy's been investigated for crimes, charged with bribery, et cetera, but, you know, to what extent does South Dakota require, or can it, you know, reasonably require or, require, you know, as I say, a 30-year-old trust officer to do that? I think that's an open question. And it's a question for US states that are actively attracting this business. You know, I spent many, many hours, and I'm sure many of you have done it on this call, listening to legislative hearing recordings in the state of South Dakota on trust bills. And I can assure you no one has wanted to ever do that before, and no one should ever do that again. But one of the findings of that was lawmakers every year approved bills related to trusts, that is, legal instruments that help wealthy people obscure their assets. Lawmakers signed off on those bills almost always without asking any questions. In fact, Senate and House lawmakers in South Dakota would even joke about the fact that no one had ever opposed those kind of bills in the past. And this Pandora Papers project was really the first time journalists like us had leaked material from inside the United States. And I think that's pretty important, and it's something we hope we get a lot more of.
Wow. So as you both mentioned, there are a lot of discoveries, a lot of surprises, but and of course, a lot of important, renowned people. I remember in my case, since there are a lot of organizations, in Puerto Rico, there was two big renowned artists, for example, that was mentioned. So each country has their own set of people that they're like, oh my God, he was involved, she was involved, they were involved. So in your case, what was your biggest surprise of either people or topics of this investigation?
I mean, everyone's got their favorite stories, right? And I think that's part of the fun of these investigations. It's a project with 12 million documents and 600 journalists is kind of like a runaway freight train. It's impossible to stop the momentum once it gets started. And it really is quite humbling as a journalist, because it makes you realize that your favorite topic might be of no interest to 560 other journalists around the world, or something that you looked over initially that you maybe found 6 months ago related to, you know, a minister in Chile or Argentina. Maybe 3 months later, because of additional reporting done by journalists we're working with in those countries, you realize, holy crap, I should have, you know, that is a huge story and I overlooked it. So something that's really cool about these kind of global, large-scale investigations is and I think that's part of the power of these kind of collaborations, is it's quite difficult for people who deserve attention not to get the attention they deserve, right? Because if the Pandora Papers had just been granted to the Washington Post or the New York Times or the Los Angeles, whatever it's called. Sorry, I'm not from America. You know, understandably, that newsroom would have had limited resources and it would have focused on stories relevant to its readership and to its geographic location. But what I love about something like the Pandora Papers is we now have stories out there in over 100 countries. And that's important, even though you and I don't consume that media on a daily basis. So much of this information, particularly when it's published in countries where governments don't have the resources to trace what their billionaires are doing, where maybe the press is under threat and reporting on politicians or billionaires is complicated. The mere fact that this information is now out there on the public record is of huge public benefit and huge public interest. So I'm always loath to say what stories I enjoyed most, because I hate putting hierarchies on kind of stories. But one of the ones that I worked on a lot that I had a lot of fun with is with the King of Jordan, just because you don't often see the passport photo of a king every day of your life. And that was in there, as was information, including quite interesting emails from his wealth advisors talking about how they could limit the disclosure of his name to government regulators for the more than 30 companies that he owned that bought up a bunch of luxury properties, including multi-million-dollar mansions in Malibu. So that was pretty fun.
Yeah, I would just add to what Will's saying that I think one of the reasons these investigations get larger than life is the model is that you're having local journalists, like local eyes, look at a global story. So they tell, that's why it kind of works, because me sitting in the US, I don't know who's surprising or who's the most newsworthy in all different parts of the world, but then I can talk to our partners and they can tell us like, this is a huge deal, or this is going to be shocking, or this is really surprising, this is really expected. This is what the key of the story is that you as a journalist, and like Will and I in the United States would not be aware of. So I think that's kind of what makes it work and makes it the impact so far reaching, that you have like the local expertise, like kind of funneling like the goods to the rest of us. It's like highly collaborative.
So getting a little bit more into the investigation itself, I don't know if you agree with me, but the findings of the investigation show what, in my opinion, are a lot of ironies. For one, many politicians had spoken publicly about being against corruption and using citizens' money for personal purposes, or they even just spoke about the country's poverty, yet they were found involved in the Pandora Papers. Although this is not right at all, do you believe this is something that can be expected of former and or current politicians?
Expected in what way? Sorry, Anna. Like, as in, were we not surprised, basically?
Yeah, exactly.
Well, I think we were surprised, like Asraa said, by the number of politicians, but also some of the barefaced doublespeak, as you said, right? Like literally the president of Kenya telling a BBC reporter in 2018, everything I have is open to the public. We're transparent. If ever someone finds something that I haven't declared or owned up to, I'll face it. And then, 2 days ago at the United Nations, he said, my name does not appear in the Pandora Papers. And I'm like, So, I mean, I think that's why we wrote about so many politicians, like Asraa said, and that's why these stories are so important. Because, as unsurprising as it might be that a king who's worth billions of dollars or a president whose family is estimated to be worth $500 million, my own personal opinion is that investigative journalism does an important job when it moves from the realm of rumor to fact, right? Like, let's go back to, say, Donald Trump, for example. Was anyone really surprised that his tax records showed some apparently creative accounting? Not really. But the value of that expose, like the value of Pandora Papers, in saying, we have the receipts, here are the documents, no longer can a politician skirt the issue, I think is really important to move from the realm of rumor to here are the facts. Now let's deal with it if we want to.
Right. It's like the Pandora Papers kind of provide the receipts on things that maybe you suspect or maybe aren't surprising, but now you have some basis, some evidence that they are being hypocritical. But it was like, as cynical as someone might be about politicians, it was kind of crazy, like politician after politician is literally on the record speaking out, maybe specifically against offshore finance, definitely against corruption, definitely in favor of transparency. And just seeing them so blatantly, taking advantage of of tax havens, and doing some interesting things in secret with their assets and their money was, even for like the most cynical journalists, I think after a while you're like, wow, like again, it was definitely ironic.
I ask it because in a sense, we all want our politicians to think that our politicians are true, are honest, and they're not lying to us. But when you, like you said, you have the receipts, and it's like an aha moment kind of thing. It's like, do we and we start analyzing, of course, you as you were working on it, us as readers, and is it surprising that they basically lied to us in a sense, or are we surprised in this point? So that's, I mean, like I said, we all want to believe that our politicians are true and honest when they address the citizens of their country. But in a sense, we gotta think to ourselves, and this makes you think, like, are we really surprised by this in a sense?
I'm surprised how so many of them think that apparently they won't get caught out by it. Which just goes to show that either they're not thinking about it very much, or they have some really bad advisors out there. Because, if I was a president and I really wanted to hire something, I would ensure that my name never appeared on any documentation, right? I'd call my neighbor next door, pay her, $50,000 and get her to put her name on everything that was passing through emails or public records. So it always surprises me how many politicians we find in these documents, because really, if it was done properly, we wouldn't. I mean, and let's be honest, some of them are very open about it. Politicians from, say, countries like Lebanon, where they say this is just how foreign business people do politics. But others are much more, I think, problematic, not even legally speaking. One of the questions we get a lot, right, Asraa, is, and criticism we get a lot is, well, nothing you've said here is definitively illegal, so why are you even talking about it? And I think when it comes to politicians, for me, that answer is so obvious. I mean, if we only ever wrote about illegal things that our politicians do, then we'd be in a pretty sad state of affairs in the United States and globally. But also, lots of the politicians didn't declare these assets that they had in documents that they're required to fill out. The Prime Minister of the Czech Republic, the President of Kenya, they all have to fill out asset statements. And to our knowledge, these offshore companies or interests were not declared on those. But to that general illegality point, I think lots of people on this call would agree that a journalist's job is not to be a policeman, policewoman, police person, prosecutor and judge, right? We produce information, we lay out in the best story form that we can think of what we have. And then, as we've seen with so many good investigations, what happens next is a result of public pressure and action and response by branches of government. And we know that the US is interested in this. We know that legislators already in Congress have introduced a bill called the Enablers Act that cites the Pandora Papers as its primary reason for introduction. Without spilling too much tea, the US's ICIJ has obviously got a lot of inquiries from government agencies around the world asking us for the data. For those of you who don't know, we never provide any of the data to governments, but it's obviously comforting to see the interest from governments around the world.
Yeah, I think there's a difference between what's legal and what's ethical. So, the whole point of the offshore system is there's a lot of loopholes, and these are people that are literally hiring experts and creating these complex structures that are, their job is to make some kind of legal mechanism to move their assets or to, shield their wealth. So yeah, legality is kind of like we get that question a lot, but it's almost like a secondary question. It's especially if you're holding public office and you're supposed to be declaring your assets. Our question is more like, have you been forthcoming? Have you been honest about things that are in the public interest? And again, it just goes back to the point of why we focus so heavily on politicians rather than, all of the multitudes of private citizens and super rich people that are in the data. I mean, those are important stories too, and they're powerful in a different way, but the accountability factor with politicians was a big theme for us. And that's kind of what we honed in on, and a lot of our partners did too.
Like you said, that there definitely is a morality to be seen or to be analyzed from the politicians. And now I want to get into the US, which you've both mentioned a lot, because it was a big surprise in this investigation, especially. So I want to get your thoughts on this quote by the former head of the Israeli Financial Intelligence Unit, Yehuda Schaefer, which I really hope I mentioned that I pronounced that name correctly.
Yep.
Thank you very much. And I quote, she says, clearly the US is a big, big loophole in the world, which is, I mean, crazy now that you mentioned loophole as well. And she continues to say, the US is criticizing all the rest of the world, but in their own backyard, this is a very, very serious issue. And I want to get of course, your opinion on what do you believe this says about the US as a country, aside from all the facts that were mentioned about the US and were found in these documents. So what does it say about the US as a country that they're the first one to speak about against offshore companies, corruption, yet a lot of this activity is and was happening under them, basically like under their noses in a sense.
There was one like kind of metaphor we kept coming up in our editorial meetings, which was like reforming offshore is kind of like a game of whack-a-mole. Maybe that's the reform in general. Like, as you know, as journalists, if you provide information and civil society, like, you know, creates an uproar about some issue as complex and niche as offshore finance, by the time you get legislation and you get the buy-in and it gets to the point of being passed, like either like special interests have carved out enough loopholes in that reform that it's not as effective as you'd want it to be, or like the bad guys have moved on, so to speak, and found like another way to exploit the system. So I think with the US, it was like, you know, they're as the global superpower, they're really at the forefront of a lot of these international bodies that are, you know, tasked with blacklists and gray lists and, you know, policing and grading different jurisdictions on, you know, their tax policies and you know, their level of secrecy. And with the US, especially in this investigation, you see that like that game of whack-a-mole kind of came back home because, and Will can speak about this in more detail, because you can see places like South Dakota are on the receiving end of people that are leaving the traditional tax havens that of popular imagination, like Panama or wherever. And it's kind of sprung up in their own backyard, so to speak, as a new like major tax haven. So yeah, I mean, it like irony or hypocrisy, whatever word you want to use on an individual level of a politician, but certainly in a policy level as well for the US, because the US is like first in line to condemn and to blacklist and to sanction other countries for, you know, not being transparent or not meeting certain global criteria. But, you know, it's thriving in individual states. The states are basically competing with each other to kind of become leaders and fill this space of, you know, create, you know, being a destination for people that want to shield their wealth.
And I think all of that's so true. And I think outside the United States, a lot of the US revelations were kind of met with a sense of, thank God someone's finally talking about this, because like countries around the world have been saying this for many, many years, that the US is full of these loopholes, that the US does not properly regulate lawyers, trust company service providers, antique dealers, private equity managers, and that decisions by the US government at a federal level, for example, its refusal to join this common reporting standard, this international agreement that would help governments around the world track where their foreigners are hiding or placing assets, that, you know, lots of governments are really frustrated with that. And I think it does, according to people we've interviewed, really give a sucker punch to the United States reputation, because it just feels as like the US has got, you know, one rule for itself and one rule for everyone else. And I think the reaction we've seen to the Pandora Papers so far has been promising, once again, to go back to what Asraa said, finally delivering up some of the specifics about these US tax havens in a way that I hope will enable the debate to go forward. Because as I said, there are so many international or intergovernmental reports pointing out the loopholes in the United States, like the ones Yehuda Schaefer referred to. But those reports, for a number of reasons, haven't really resonated until now. I'm not entirely sure, based on the coverage I've seen in South Dakotan press, that it resonated quite as much as it needed to. But, you know, I've worked on enough of these complicated and sometimes very boring offshore stories to know that reform doesn't happen overnight, right? That, we were talking a lot about within ICIJ for many, many months. Would the reaction to this investigation be the same as the Panama Papers? Because after that project, you might remember there were protests in the street. People in Iceland were throwing bananas and yogurt, and people in Pakistan were throwing rocks. You know, this time around, we didn't see many or any protests so far, certainly not on that scale, but we have obviously started to see significant impact that Asraa is very well versed in, because she's our kind of chief impact whip officer.
Maybe it has to go along with the fact that it's in the sense like I was alluding to the not being surprised kind of thing. Maybe they showed more anger towards the first investigation because it was a shock, and I think that's why it was very very prominent as this one, but the Panama Papers, because it was the first of this caliber, the first investigation of this caliber. So maybe they're mad, but they're not surprised.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, we had a lot of soul searching and sleepless nights at ICIJ, wondering how this project would be received. You know, would people just shrug and say, ugh, another Panama Papers, seen it all before, heard it all before, you know, move on. And I think it's been a relief to see that because of the quality of reporting and because of the focuses of our reporting, that hasn't necessarily been the case. I'm sure some people still think that, and certainly on Reddit they do. But you know, it's been received, I think, better than I'd hoped.
Yeah, I think Panama Papers maybe introduced a lot of people to the concept of offshore. But in some ways, like that was the Panama Papers was a leak of one offshore service provider. So you could kind of think that this is maybe a bad actor, a bad apple, or, you know, like a one-off. Whereas with Pandora Papers, I get them mixed up too sometimes, but with Pandora Papers,
so do I.
Pandora Papers were coming back with 14, a leak of 14 different providers. So it's a more global in scope, it's more definitive. We're seeing similar trends in these service providers all over the world, from the Caribbean to the Middle East to Switzerland. It's like basically the same story again and again. So I think like Panama Papers maybe introduced people to the concept and like one really strong example, and this is kind of like kicking the door open on like, this is across the board, this is how these offshore service providers behave, and this is what tax havens are doing, how they're affecting society in all different corners of the world. So kind of almost like giving us a chance to really be more authoritative. Like, no, this isn't just one case or one, we didn't just find one bad actor. This is like a whole host of problematic activity across the board at everywhere we're looking.
It's a bit like when you go to Safeway and you buy a nice punnet of strawberries, and the first one you pick up is a little bruised, and you're like, God damn it. But you presume the rest of them will be fine. And then you realize that they're all just disgusting.
Maybe as people give themselves a chance to read the Pandora Papers, and they see that, because, for example, like I mentioned in Puerto Rico, there was an article, but it was specifically for the people that are Puerto Ricans that were found in the Pandora Papers. So maybe as people give themselves a chance to read more about this, maybe they haven't even read the Panama Papers. Some people haven't. So maybe as more people, start to read, they'll start to make their voices of anger, disappointment, be more heard towards everything that was discovered in this, because there are definitely much more discoveries and much more findings in this investigation.
Yeah. And like we do with every ICIJ investigation, we are starting the process now of opening up the data eventually to other journalists. 600 journalists is a ridiculously large number of journalists to manage and try and coordinate. But one of our missions and roles at ICIJ is to work with other reporters. We've done that before on projects, including working with journalists from US state or regional outlets, right? I mean, hand on heart, I think it's I mean, I could say I know the documents fairly well. There are Americans from Tennessee and New Hampshire, and I haven't checked Vermont or Maine, but there are Americans from all kinds of states, and often they're going to be people of interest. Because I think let's always remember, you kind of don't appear in a leak of offshore data unless you got a bit of coin or unless you're a little fancy, right? I mean, I don't, to my knowledge, and I don't think my parents do. So from a journalistic perspective, my starting point with these kind of documents is you're kind of going to be of interest if you appear in there at all, really. And often that's the case. They're philanthropists, they're business people. Maybe they appear in local court records having a messy divorce where the husband tried to cheat the wife out of, some of the alimony or something like that. So, for anyone listening, certainly hit us up and write to Asraa and I if you've got an interest in looking at this Pandora Papers data. It won't be overnight, but it's certainly part of our grand scheme.
Right, like these are people with either enough expendable income or enough need to be secretive about their transactions, that they're hiring people to set this stuff up for them in very complex, almost mind-boggling ways. So like Will was saying, the baseline for people participating in the system is already pretty high. They're going to be interesting people.
Right, like I use free TurboTax because I don't want to pay anyone to do my taxes. These are people who are paying accountants and lawyers $5, $10, $15, $25,000 to help them set up a bank account in a country they've never even visited.
Definitely, I think we can call normal people will be, I don't think so, right? I haven't seen the papers, but as what was mentioned, definitely normal people wouldn't be involved in that scheme. And I do want to allude to the 600 more journalists that Will was mentioning and change the topic of conversation rather from the context of the investigation rather than the working in it. So I can speak from experience that I've only worked with maximum 2 journalists in the articles. So could you please speak about the process of working with 600 journalists, not only in the same country, but just around the world?
So I can start and then Will can go. Will is actually our regional coordinator for Africa and the Middle East. So he can talk more about the relationships with in specific regions. And I'll talk a little bit more about the technology that facilitates this. So ICIJ has been around for, a while, and they've kind of built as the organization has grown and as the size and scope of their collaborations have grown, they've invested in technology to kind of facilitate bigger and bigger collaborations. And I think that's why the trajectory has been what it's been. So we have I'll cover all the boring part of collaboration and Will can talk about the interesting stuff. So we have like a couple platforms that really facilitate this kind of exchange of information. One is called the iHub, and it's kind of like an old-fashioned like forum where there's like topics and subtopics, and then there's like a thread. Some people say it's like Facebook. I think it's more like one of those old-fashioned like Tumblr accounts or something where like basically we have boards on like groups about all kinds of different topics. Like there was a politician group, there's a billionaires group, there's a business people group, there's a celebrities group. And then within that, it's like pretty organized by like country or people of interest. And people just share what they're finding on there. It's very easy and fluid to talk to whoever you want and wherever you want. And kind of find what you're looking for. And we have like a whole tech team that's constantly like maintaining and trying to improve that platform to make it easier to use, and not just easier to use, but also able to be used more widely, because we in the US are privileged to have like the latest computers, like pretty reliable internet, and some of our partners don't have those luxuries. So like there's all kinds of things that our tech team does to just kind of lower the bar from a technical perspective to make sure journalists in all kinds of circumstances can effectively use these platforms. So that's the iHub. That's kind of like our global newsroom, virtual global newsroom. And then the other one is data share, which is how you view the documents themselves. And there's all kinds of training. We have a training manager named Yelena who kind of spearheads this, where basically every stage of the reporting, she and others, but she leads it, trainings on that stage of the reporting. So like Pandora Papers reporting begins, she'll do sessions on like, okay, here's how you first start getting acquainted and finding your way around these documents. Then she'll go into more and more specialized type trainings as the reporting process advances. So you're kind of like learning by doing, or like learning as you're getting deeper and deeper into the document. So yeah, iHub and DataShare are like custom ICIJ tools. There's other tools, but I think those are like the two big ones. And then like encrypted email is really important. We communicate, you know, in emails that are secure, and then rely a lot on Signal and WhatsApp and that kind of thing for more one-to-one communication. But that's how we do it from a technical perspective. Will can talk about the more interesting part, which is all the relationships that you kind of build.
All the gossip. Because I mean, I think it's important advice. Don't try and, if you haven't done a collaboration before, don't aim for a collaboration of 600 reporters tomorrow. The only reason we could do that scale is because of projects we've done in the past, led by ICIJ's director and led by our former deputy director, Marina Walker, for example, who were able to build many of those personal relationships. Like I always say, and I think this is true, and I think this is why ICIJ succeeds. We work with some of the best journalists in the world, but there are also great journalists in the world, around the world, who I have no desire to work with on an ICIJ collaboration at all. Some journalists are just not made for collaboration, you know, which is not to take away from their skills. It's just, I don't want to spend 2 years of my life trying to get blood from a stone. Like Asraa was talking about iHub, where journalists share their findings. That's a specific requirement that journalists have to acknowledge in a kind of broad agreement when they sign up to the project, which is I will regularly communicate and share my findings. And if you're not the kind of person who enjoys that, if you're the kind of person who instinctively feels like, well, no, I don't want to share the fact that I just found the president of Ecuador in the data because someone else might run away with it, then you're not really going to be an ICIJ kind of fit. Like, I think it works well because we have that balance. You know, we work with a limited number of media partners in each country. So every journalist still feels as though they have ownership and exclusivity over most, if not all, of their national reporting. But at the same time, you're kind of expected to give up the goods, right? Like, so if I find a Mexican politician, I'm meant to share that on iHub, just like if a Mexican finds an Australian or an American lead of interest, they're meant to share that as well. And that only exists because people trust ICIJ and they trust the ICIJ model. And that's why they agree to be part of these investigations.
Yeah, and these relationships, I mean, there's tons of new partners on this project, but some of these relationships have also been honed over years across projects. So that also kind of helps.
And some of them improve a lot over time. Without naming names, there have been some awful partners a few years ago who now, 4 or 5 years later, are complete joys to work with. I mean, that's just human nature, isn't it, right? Like you know, we've all met friends or, you know, had romantic relationships where on first sight we hated that person to our very core, and now all of a sudden we've married them. I feel like ICIJ is a bit like that sometimes.
Yeah, totally. It's also with investigative journalism, you're kind of going against your instinct to guard your scoop or your exclusive findings. So you're really running counter to like what you might have been immersed in newsroom culture, which is to like hold on to your exclusive thing, maybe sometimes even from your own coworkers. So you're really going against the grain of some parts of journalism culture with what we're asking people on the investigation to do.
And I'm afraid I'm going to have to leave you all here now and run off to a prior engagement. But thank you very much for the invitation, and I'll leave you in Asraa's capable hands.
No, thank you for your time. We really appreciate it.
Thanks. And reach out anytime to anyone who's listening. I'd love to hear from you all.
So yeah, you mentioned the technical stuff as being boring, but from a personal perspective, I love platforms for working and collaboratively. So I really like those type of platforms. So I'm gonna. I had a question about there was as you know, the main investigation, and there's other articles related to the investigation that you published. And I was reading the one involving the artists and sports players that were involved in the investigation. And one of the key things that I think it mentioned, although it didn't, you know, went deep into it, was the consequences for, like we were saying, normal citizens, because people either don't report their taxes, don't pay their taxes, don't report their earnings, their the things that they, for example, cars and the properties, that was the word I was looking for, thank you. And can you speak upon the consequences that these actions, of course, involving offshore companies, can have for normal everyday citizens? And basically, why do you think people should care about the Pandora Papers? I know we know why they should care, but if there's somebody here that hasn't, for example, read the Pandora Papers, why do you think they should read it? Why do you think they should care about this investigation?
Oh, totally. I mean, we literally ask this question all the time over the course of this investigation, like, why should people care that some rich people do secret stuff with their money? Like, it's no skin off my back, you know? But I think, so there's a couple answers. First of all, the most common reason, or the most common explanation for why someone would want to like move their money to a different country or, you know, shield their assets is tax avoidance or tax evasion, you know, and it's, again, sometimes it's legal. It's not always criminal tax evasion. Sometimes they're exploiting loopholes or just finding ways to skirt certain taxes. And of course that affects everyone. I think like with the timing of this project coming out in the midst of a global pandemic, it's just like, I think we're all feeling on an individual level, like the measures that governments have had to take to deal with the pandemic and the related economic crises all over the world. You know, public revenue is, you know, I think it's front and center these days. I think people are more acutely aware of how important, you know, the need for public funding or resources in countries to deal with crises that affect all of us. So I think like the number one, you know, the most common like answer for why you should care is like, you know, these are taxes that are not, these are potentially taxes that aren't being paid or limiting some of the richest people are getting away with paying less taxes, which means less money for education, for public health, for social services, depending on how your country is structured. So that's probably the most common answer. But then the thing with our reporting, you're seeing like time and time again, there's all kinds of other ways that financial secrecy harms people. I mean, one of the stories that Will worked on with the Washington Post was that was on Belize, where basically a lot of Belize has become kind of a common destination for Americans looking to use the offshore system. And it's so secretive and so beyond reach. It's like US law enforcement actually sometimes can't pierce the secrecy. So people that are, you know, under investigation for crime, people that owe child support, all kinds of problematic behavior, they're able to hide their assets and, you know, out of reach of law enforcement and out of reach of the people that they owe money to. There's other examples of, you know, secret investors that make very perverse kind of like relationships that you wouldn't think of. So one of their stories is about the Legions of Christ, which is like this kind of this Catholic religious order that has gotten, it's caught up in this, it's become very notorious because of a pedophilia scandal, global scandal. And our reporting shows that their money went to these trusts that were invested in corporate landlords in the US that are behind some aggressive evictions during the pandemic. So, I mean, it's like this hop, skip, and a jump of like, wow, like the secret financial interests and incentives behind things that are affecting like everyday people like you and me are just, the offshore world makes these like global financial maneuvers, just make these mind-boggling connections behind the scenes that like, you know, you would have no idea that the investor behind a corporate landlord in the US is, you know, handling the money of this disgraced religious order from Mexico. You know, it's like, there's just so many examples of that in the data, just beyond the fact that we're missing out on tax revenue. It's also that, you know, there's secret financial interests at play that play out in so many complex ways that we tried, you know, our best to kind of dissect and show in a couple of different ways in the investigation. Another one is Cambodia. There was a story we did at the Washington Post about relics and antiquities, you know, in Cambodia that have basically been looted out of the country, and the country is trying to recover them. They're of religious significance, they're part of the cultural heritage of that country. And, you know, without going, wait, you know, you should read the story. It's a really good story. But basically the stories about how like one notorious trader kind of used offshore trusts as he was kind of trying to make sure I'm saying this legally correctly, as you know, as investigators were like trying to locate what happened with the artifacts that were in his possession. The documents show that he created 2 trusts, and then the article gets into how those kind of played a role in these artifacts that are missing, that are part of like Cambodia's, you know, national treasure, that are just out there. Sometimes some of them ended up in very prominent museums in the US. So yeah, I think like tax revenue, sorry, it's a very long-winded answer, but also just it just sheds light on these financial incentives and motivations at play that you would have no idea about if like you didn't have access to these kind of records.
I feel like, as you were mentioning, the whole cycle of the whole trail.
Yeah.
Something specific. I feel like there would have to be a board with pinpoints, like this goes from here to here.
It's like that meme of that guy with the pin and the board. Like, yeah, it literally felt like that sometimes when we're trying to write this stuff. Yeah, totally.
And I want to go back to the process of working on it. I think one of the things that is not very talked about among investigative journalists and journalists in general is mental health. So it was a 2-year investigation involving a lot of journalists, a lot of documents, and not only was it, you know, working with a lot of people, but it was also remotely. I mean, you were because you wouldn't have the collaboration in the newsroom. You had to be collaborating on your own, basically on your isolation because of the pandemic. So from your perspective, or perspective of other colleagues, of course without mentioning names if it's not because it's not correct, how did you all end up feeling after all this work?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, it's just been such a challenging, how long has it been now? Like 1.5 years since this pandemic's been going on. So yeah, I think there's so many levels of the topic you're bringing up. First of all, like a lot of newsrooms need to put all of their resources into covering the ongoing pandemic. So for example, we had, you know, we had this meeting, with all of the partners talking, where we make some key decisions about when we're going to publish and this and that, and the name of the investigation. And so at that time, I remember our partners in India were experiencing like this spike of COVID cases, and they were just totally immersed in not only covering that, but experiencing it themselves, like either getting sick or having loved ones get sick. So it was just, I mean, it's been a brutal year for everybody. And then journalists have this kind of like added responsibility of having to experience the brutality of this pandemic and then cover it as well. So that was just like, it happened with the previous investigation we did last year, FinCEN files too, where like some of the newsrooms just could not put as much effort into this, time and effort into this investigation because they had a crisis to cover. So that was one level of it. I think, yeah, and the other thing is, I've only been at ICIJ for a year, but every investigation, they typically have a meeting in person early on in the project to kind of meet each other in person, talk about the major themes, make some, and you know, it's like the whole point of having conferences, like connecting with someone in person creates a different level of trust, where you're more likely to be able to collaborate and share findings and reach out when you need help. So that didn't happen with this investigation, which, you know, kind of, I think it's remarkable how much we collaborated without that. But I think, you know, that's definitely been challenging. We did a virtual version, but, you know, it's not the same as meeting all these journalists in person. I think, so it is this kind of investigation is super challenging, super boring in a sense that you're just looking at financial documents, like people's like registration forms or like their emails with their wealth manager. Like it's not like the finding is ultimately, when you piece it all together and you do a ton of reporting, it creates like a really, you can draw out the story there, but the actual documents there's a lot of tedium in those documents. So as draining as the investigation was, I would say like feeling like you're part of this like big global thing and you're kind of all in together and you're choosing to take time to, that this is really important. And it, you know, like I was saying earlier, the pandemic kind of made it even more clear why like tax revenue does actually, a country's tax revenue does actually affect each and every one of us. In a way, there was a sense of camaraderie and like motivation that like, okay, I'm miserable staying at home like week after week in my corner of the world, but you know, my colleagues in wherever, Australia, India, Europe, everywhere, you know, they're going through the same thing, but we're all like in this, we're all committed to this investigation. We feel it's important and we're gonna like put the work in to make it happen, was, you know, kind of motivating. You know, it kind of made you feel less isolated. So that was probably a very roundabout answer. But yeah, I think with journalists in general, it's like been a mixed bag, and it's definitely been really, really challenging.
You mentioned that you, and thank you for that answer. You mentioned that you came into ICIJ almost a year ago. Was it hard because since the investigation, I suppose it had been already on, it was ongoing when you got here. Was it?
Yeah.
How was it, you know, getting into the process because you weren't there from the beginning? So you had to like, in a sense, keep up with everything that had already been done in a year. So how was that process for you personally?
For me personally, I would say like the iHub and just people's generosity, just you quickly get with the program that this is like a different crew of investigative journalists. So like, it's almost like a secret society where everyone's just like, I mean, it might sound cheesy, but they're very like generous and forthcoming and they want to work together. So it was really refreshing and always astonishing. I mean, it's still astonishing to me when like somebody finds something amazing and they just immediately share it. Like, I mean, I can give you a specific example, like the Chilean president, Sebastián Piñera, is now facing an impeachment bid because of findings in the Pandora Papers. So we wrote mini profiles of around 60 of the top names and published them at ICIJ. So initially we had, and when we write those profiles, we're in touch with the partners in the country to make sure we're getting it right, that we've researched everything we can, that we're highlighting the right things in the story. So we had written the profile like early on because he was one of the names that we had found quite early. And then, you know, it had gone through edits, fact check, legal. It was ready to, you know, it was ready to be published whenever. And then like a couple weeks before publication, our Chilean partners came back and they were like, oh, in the last couple of months, we found way more that is even more consequential. And there's links that we found to like, you know, you can read the profile if you want to know the details, but they just found all this stuff that's more like deeper connections than what was initially apparent the first time we wrote the profile. So they were on the phone with us. I'm talking like days before the publication, walking us through legal documents and, you know, Spanish language legal documents. Our reporter was also Spanish speaking. We have Spanish speaking on staff, but still just their local expertise and taking time out of their busy schedule to like make sure we're getting the story right in English based on the Spanish documents and understanding the intricate details. It was just like an amazing level of generosity and commitment that like they cared as much for us to get the story right in our little mini profile as, you know, their front page story. So yeah, I would say I think it's just a testament to the 600 journalists we work with. They're just very generous and they're just top caliber and they care more about the journalism than any ownership of like a finding or scoop or getting credit. You know, of course we do give credit everywhere we can, but still like 600 people, you kind of get lost in the crowd. So yeah, so I would say that it was definitely overwhelming and it's mind-boggling actually to work with that many people, but just the way that people were so committed to the greater project and not just their individual like newsroom or even their individual story it's just really remarkable.
So definitely you would work on another 600 journalists collaborate.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, if and again, this investigation was just so massive. We kind of needed it. I mean, it's a hell of a lot of work to coordinate that many people, but at the same time, the findings were that much more revelatory because we had 600 eyes on it.
So I want to take this time. I know there are a few people here in the Zoom, but I suppose there are other people in the Facebook that haven't been looking at it specifically, to see if somebody has other questions that they would like to ask you, to basically open the floor to questions from our public.
Awesome.
I can see the chat, so let me see if somebody here writes in the chat, or if somebody has either Adam has access to the Facebook to see the comments if there are any questions. So we were asked, or you were asked, Asraa, how did you get involved in ICIJ?
So I was an editor at an investigative outlet, but it was almost like the opposite of ICIJ. It was like, it's called the Chicago Reporter. It's like tiny newsroom, like less than 10 people. I think when I left staff, there was only 5 people left. So it was like hyper local, focused on Chicago and very small. We did collaborate a lot with other news organizations, but it was investigative. And so how did I get involved with ICIJ? They were hiring a digital editor. And I applied, and I applied for the job, and I mean, it was really interesting to go. What was interesting was being from a very small, scrappy investigative newsroom that's like super local. It actually made me, when I came to ICIJ, where when you're working at ICIJ, you kind of feel like you're in the mothership of this big operation. Like you're kind of like the small, like I don't want to say control centers. So all of our partners have editorial independence, but just kind of like the central coordinator of like this big constellation of journalists. So because I had come from a small investigative newsroom that was really scrappy and experiencing its ups and downs with fundraising and whatnot, I could really relate to our partners and kind of like the ups and downs they deal with and kind of what we could do on our end to help them out. So like even something as simple as like not every newsroom has the luxury of having like a social team or graphics people on staff. And I understood that because I came from such a small news organization. So it was really important for me as a digital editor to create assets that are easy for them to use, that use the branding and our color scheme and our, because I knew that our smaller partners might not necessarily have the capacity or someone on staff to create custom graphics that look really cool and look like the rest of the investigation. So I think on a really granular level, coming from a small hyperlocal investigative outlet to this, global coordinator thing, I think it helped me out a lot because I understood where our partners, some of our smaller partners especially, were coming from.
It shows that you should work hyper locally, and then just start expanding in experience.
It's invaluable to come from an environment where you have to do a lot of things yourself and wear a lot of hats, to be able to facilitate that for other newsrooms and other journalists working in all kinds of different environments.
So while we see if we get at least one last question from the audience, I do have one, like if there aren't, and I was going to say if there aren't any more questions, I do have one that can, on closing remarks, there are a lot of things that we have learned either from the Pandora Papers and just working with 600 journalists in general, but I would think that there are early career journalists like myself in this panel, or as an audience in this panel. So I would like to see if you could share some wisdom with us and what is your advice for other journalists working on investigations regarding leaked files or important public figures.
I don't know if I don't know if I'm very wise to share much wisdom, but so early career journalists working with so I think like don't be afraid to, I think like security is so important with this kind of sensitive material, or if you're working with people working in environments that are hostile to press freedom, which doesn't have to necessarily be internationally, even locally journalists are, in the US, sometimes journalists are dealing with a lot of hostility, lawsuits or what have you. So I think one big learning curve for me when I came to work at ICIJ is like, I think before I was like, oh, encrypted email, I don't know. I'm like, I don't like technology, like whatever. But I think like there's so many generous there's so many people in the journalism world or in the cybersecurity, adjacent cybersecurity world that are just so, that they really know what they're doing and they're really willing to help. So I think not being shy about that aspect of it will open up a whole new world of being able to feel confident that you're securely communicating with people. So yeah, I would say don't be shy about that. Don't be shy to ask questions about, like, if you're not in a technical role or if technology isn't your jam, like, don't be shy about getting help on that front, because it does open up a lot of doors once you're able to operate. So that's one thing. What was the other part of your question? Was on public figures. I would say, like, gosh, I think like the thing that was the most, so because our project is secret and we have this like global unveiling, we had to be super coordinated about requesting comment. And the interesting thing to me was like the letters we were sending to politicians were just so thorough and giving them every chance to explain. And I think, like, I guess different news, every newsroom reaches out for comment, but I think one thing that surprised me about ICIJ is just like the level of detail and the questions they're asking, but they're doing that to just kind of leave no room for error, because the documents only tell us so much. All of our research and reporting on what we're seeing in the documents only tell us so much. The only person that knows the full story is the politician or their wealth managers that did these transactions to begin with. So it was interesting to me when we're sending out these letters, we're basically telling them, like, this is exactly what we have on you, and can you please explain in great detail, which almost felt like, again, because I had never worked on this kind of leaked, I've never worked on leaked documents or this kind of complex financial reporting. So it was all pretty new to me, but I felt better publishing and also like talking to our lawyer as we were getting ready to publish these like findings on these high level politicians. I was like, okay, we gave them not only a lot of time to respond, but we were really transparent about, like, here's what we had, what we found, and we want to know, like, can you explain this, or what's your response to this? So yeah, that process was, like, in terms of reporting on high level figures, was really interesting, because a lot of times we got no answer. Sometimes we got interesting answers that we'd have to revisit our reporting, like, okay, they said this, and now we have to go back and, rewrite what we wrote and re-fact check. But yeah, just not being afraid to, if you're confident about your reporting and your research, just not being afraid to go to that high level person and be like, here's what I got. It's your turn. Here's your chance to explain it. I'm going to publish it because I feel strongly that ethically and journalistically, I've done everything I can to fully report out this story. I thought that would be a really scary process, but just because of the quality of the reporting and the integrity all the journalists involved had, like, it was actually like a moment of feeling very confident about what we were doing, which was surprising because I was pretty nervous writing about, just nervous that we were getting the story that we dotted every I and crossed every T and getting the story as right as we possibly could. When you're just looking at financial documents and emails, it's not like, the story is definitely not spelled out. You have to do a lot of work on top of that to make sense of what you're seeing. So yeah, another long-winded answer.
Oh, no, it's okay. And when you say I'm not wise enough, are you kidding? No, this has been amazing. Personally, I've learned a lot, and I would not want to, but I think I can speak for everybody here that we have learned so much from you and from Will, which unfortunately had to leave, but we learned a lot from the time that he was here. So I think I will close this off because, like I said, you're very busy. So thank you so much for your time, for your wisdom, and for your candor with the answers and with explaining the process of this investigation. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. And if you guys have any other questions, or like Will was saying, if you want to investigate this stuff yourself, I can't guarantee an overnight answer, but we do have a process for bringing more journalists in. We want more eyes on this because it's such a big leak, just to reach out to ICIJ or reach out to me personally, and I'll try to connect you to the right person, or happy to chat more about this because it is a pretty cool process.
Well, thank you so much. And thank you to everybody that tuned in to our panel. Have a lovely night wherever you are in this world at the moment.
Thanks so much. Good night.
Good night.